So the cross bridge cycle is the final step in this pathway. So at low intracellular calcium concentration, and the intracellular would be within the sarcoplasm, which is the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. When it's low, the tropomyosin is going to block the active sites on actin. The myosin heads cannot attach to actin, and the muscle fiber is going to remain relaxed. Voltage sensitive proteins and T tubules change shape, causing the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium to the cytoplasm. When it does contract, so at higher intracellular calcium concentrations, those calcium ions bind to troponin. So this cycle happens where the myosin then can grab the actin to form the cross bridges. So the cycle is initiated, the sarcomere shortens and muscle contracts. When the nervous system stimulation stops and there's no more acetylcholine released, calcium returns to storage, goes back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and contraction ends. So looking at this illustration, we can see the four different steps in the cross bridge cycle. So up here we see one sarcomere, but we're going to just blow up where this box is. So the first step that happens is the cross bridge formation. The energized myosin attaches to the actin, and it does this by breaking down ATP. So you can see ADP present here, and that's because the ATP has been broken down to ADP, released an inorganic phosphate, which represents enough energy so that that myosin now can physically move and attach to its binding site. So remember, the actin is the thin filament, the myosin is the thick filament, and the yellow molecule that we see here is the troponin, and the longer string-like molecule is the tropomyosin. Both of those are the regulatory molecules that block actin. So the second step of this is what's called the power or working stroke. And this is going to allow the myosin to physically move from this state to this state. So it literally moves like this and pulls the thin filament inward towards the H zone, thus leading to the shortening of the sarcomere. In the absence of ATP, the myosin heads will not detach, and that eventually leads to rigor mortis, which happens at the point of death. So we'll be seeing that in the next slide. But for this cross bridge to occur, there has to be two ATPs that are used. This next ATP is used for cross bridge attachment, because the ATP is enough energy for the myosin to go back to its resting position, and then it's going to repeat the cycle again. So the cycle will continue as long as ATP is available and and calcium is bound to troponin. So again, ATP and calcium are the two super important chemicals for this process. Then there is cocking of the myosin head, and we can see that the myosin head goes back to its original position. So this cycle is going to continue to repeat itself as long as calcium and ATP are available. So a really good analogy for this to think about for the power, or what's called the working stroke, is to think about grabbing a rope. And by grabbing the rope with your hand, this is going to cause cross bridge formation. Then when you pull the rope towards you, that is the power stroke. The next step is to let go of the rope. That would be cross bridge detachment, and then to reach forward and grab another part of the rope. So you can see this is the marker. So the person grabbed the rope right before the marker, pulled the rope towards them, then released, and then grabbed another part of the rope further ahead of the marker. So this is exactly what the myosin does when it starts to pull the actin inward towards the H zone. So the example of rigor mortis is going to be on this next slide as a homeostatic imbalance. So it's not a really pleasant thing to think about, but for those of you that are going into the funeral sciences, it's a really good example. Rigor mortis usually occurs about 3 to 4 hours after death. The muscles are going to begin to stiffen, and medical examiners use this to determine the time of death to make it more accurate. The rigidity occurs at about 12 hours post-mortem. And what happens at the point of death is all the intracellular calcium levels increase because there's no longer ATP present. So the calcium cannot be returned back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Because all that calcium is released, all that calcium is automatically going to bind to troponin. And since it does do that, it results in cross bridge formation where the myosin binds to the actin. So that's what's responsible for this state of rigor that happens at the point of death. And we know from the last slide that the second part of the cross bridge cycle cannot occur. So therefore, there is no cross bridge detachment. It results in the myosin head staying bound to actin, causing a constant state of contraction, this rigor. So the muscles stay contracted until the myosin proteins break, or the muscle proteins break down. Eventually, when this happens, the myosin releases, and there is no longer the state of rigor mortis for that individual.